Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. It's a pleasure to be here and to be presenting this afternoon on the history of floristic knowledge in Trinidad and Tobago. And when I say floristic, I am talking about plants, okay? Um, Before we could even think about the natural history of plants or animals, we first have to collect, we have to observe, we have to document. And then we can reach to the stage of actually talking about the biodiversity, etc. about it. So I'm going to look at the history and where it's taken us today. Next. Okay, so the outline of the presentation, a quick classification on the living world, history of plant collecting in Trinidad and Tobago, publication of the flora, conservation of the flora of Trinidad and Tobago, glimpses of our biodiversity, impact of collection on research, and concluding remarks. Okay, so according to Whitaker, he proposed 5 kingdoms of classification for the living world. You have the monera, that will be all your bacteria. Your protists would be your algae. Your fungi, mushroom, yeast, mold. Plants, non-vascular, which would be your mosses, liverworts, hornworts. Vascular, and of course, animals. Focusing on this little bit here for the vascular flora of Trinidad and Tobago. But of course, we have members of the club who have been known to collect mushrooms, and then there's algae and stuff. So my work would be just here. So if you want to address floristic knowledge in Trinidad, and I think you understand what floristic is now, Chris, it's predominantly with the arrival of the Europeans on the islands in July 1498. They documented their travels, observation, and experiences, which were preserved over the centuries in the form of written text, specimens, and or drawings. You may well ask, what happened to the pre-Columbian period? What happened to them? Well, their information is stored in archaeological finds, which I wouldn't go into, but there are papers written on it. Next. So this is a good example of a collection of a leaf sample from Tobago. And if you can read, you'll see Tobago written somewhere here. If your eyes are good, like not as good as mine. This was taken at the Hans Sloane Herbarium at the Natural History Museum in London, England. And it is referenced as in a folio. Now, in those days, they would mount the plants on big mountain sheets, and they will bind them in big volume folders, and these folders are enormous. So next. So this is an example of what that folder looks like there, and you can look at the scale. There's Shane Baller, myself, and Shahada Paltu. They were with me in London in 2018. What I want to show is there is the real dried specimen mounted here, and there is an illustration of it. So that was the practice. Remember, they didn't have digital cameras and all the fancy photographic tools. So drawings and botanical artists were very, very important in this. They actually traveled on expeditions to record plants and animals. Now today, we don't have them in folio volumes like that anymore, but we have them just on sheets of paper like this, and this is a sample of Aristolochia buzae, which is an endemic species to Trinidad and Tobago. Endemic meaning, as far as we know, only found in Trinidad, not even in Tobago, anywhere else in the world. And the collector was the late Hans Booze's brother, Julius Booze, and it was identified by a lady at Kew called Jacqueline Pinder. So and we only know that the collection was from Grand Ravine Forest Reserve. I believe later on, Hans got a plant and brought it up to the north and propagated it. Yeah, but this is endemic as far as we know next. Okay, so the early period, I've divided the plant collecting into 3 periods. I call this period 1535, Gonzalo Ovidio Valdez published his most celebrated work, and I translated it, The General History of the Indies Islands and the Mainland of Ocean Sea. And this contained early first-hand observation of the Caribbean natural history published in Europe, some of which appear to have been made in Trinidad. And this was reported in Urban 1898, Flora, Simberley, and Lani. Next. So look at plant collecting now. So during the period 1540 to right down to here, 1659 to 1741, we had Gonzalez, which I just mentioned. Then you had Rochefort. He collected in Tobago, and they wrote the natural history. He was actually a priest, I think a minister of some sort. So he was interested in the morals of the indigenous people as well. And he came here actually to convert them, if you read the story about him. But he surveyed the Caribbean and wrote up some of his botanical and even animal collections during that time. Then we come to John Points, and that's Point is the way to pronounce it rather than that spelling. um, he made 11 trips to Tobago, and he proposed the famous and fertile island of Tobago. And he provided an early survey of its climate, the natural products, and crop potential, including the prospect for growing cocoa, sugarcane, and tobacco. So you're beginning to see the early thinking of transforming the natural vegetation into productive plantation crops. Then we come on to Edmund Hillary, who was a famous astronomer, a mathematician, and he went to Trinidad and Tobago, and he sent plants to this apothecary, James Peteo. Why do you think he'll send plants to an apothecary? Anybody can give a guess? Huh? Medicine, yeah, absolutely. So again, they're beginning to survey medicinal plants. Where would they be getting their information from medicinal plants? Indigenous people, yeah, you're going 1742. Next, Chris. So we come on again. You have Andrew Young. He is one. He was the first curator of the St. Vincent Botanic Garden, which is the oldest established garden in the Caribbean. It's still around, and he visited and collected in Tobago, and again recorded some of the plants he saw and collected. LeBlanc, Trinidad, again toured the island and wrote up again. So what I'm trying to show here is these things are being recorded, and they are the earliest records of our collection. Next, please. Then you have people like the French collector, and you would see now some of these plants are now found in the Paris Herbarium. You would have Tobago deposited collections in London and Paris. These were just collectors that were private, non-well-known people. They just collected on their own, but yet still their material is deposited in herbaria in London and Paris. Aldridge collected living orchids. In those days, they used to actually carry living plants from throughout these islands back to the UK and to establish them in greenhouses and things. That's how, if you remember the story of breadfruit, how it came from the Pacific to here. They didn't have refrigeration and tissue culture and that sort of stuff. But they did collect live material. And then you had this pharmacist, again, collecting, traveling, and in Tobago. So you see, there a lot of activities been in Trinidad and Tobago for quite some time. Next, please. So by the 19th century, both Trinidad and Tobago were more stable. And by that, I mean, prior to that, there's a lot more collection during the 1500 in places like Cuba and Jamaica and Hispaniola. But the Southern Caribbean were less visited because of the wars that were taking place between the colonials fighting over the island. So the seas were very dangerous with lots of pirates of the Caribbean. Yeah. So you find now, by this time, there was a little more stability in the region, politically stable, and we had now the establishment in 1880 of the 1818 the Royal Botanic Gardens, which is now we still have in Trinidad, and the establishment of the Herbarium in 1887. So this also stimulated exploration in the country and in Trinidad and Tobago in particular. Yes, Chris. So the garden was established as an abandoned sugar plantation, some of you may know that, near Port Spain, as an enterprise concerned with the acclimatization of economic plants. And what is that showing you? That the garden wasn't really set up as a show garden or for recreation, but as a research center to start establishing plants, and particularly plants of economic importance to spread across the region for economic purposes. Next. So This is three of the earliest superintendents of the garden. You had Kruger. I don't have a picture of Lockhart. I don't know if anybody in this club knows Lockhart or any of that history, but we don't have a picture of him. Purdy is, we don't have a picture of Purdy either, but this is Hermann Kruger. He was actually a German chemist that started off as a chemist in the country and ended up in the Botanic Garden as the curator. And he explored Trinidad extensively, not only sticking to the garden and ornamental. Then presto, he was famous for his interest in palms and Hart then set up the herbarium. Next, first. This is the only evidence we have of Purdy. Some of you may have seen this in the garden, yes, of the evidence of Purdy. He died at age 40, and I think he said he died from yellow fever or from malaria, I'm not too sure, but he died pretty young. Next. So I spoke about the superintendents, but I want to say something about Hart. Hart formalized the administrative structure that an active herbarium was important to effectively run a botanic garden. So by 1908, the herbarium collection contained over 25,000 specimens. So go next, first. So by 1903, the herbarium comprised of that 12,000 specimens, with 6,282 were indigenous flora. So you see these guys were very, very busy collecting plants apart from the garden. First, there were 3,000, and by 1905, 18 years later, we had 25,000 specimens in the collection. Next. So active collection, non-residents, so we could call them explorers, came to Trinidad. They had Bonshak, William Morrison, collection at the Natural History Museum and his collections for Flora. Griesbach made good use of these amateur collectors and recorded them in his first publication on the flora of the British Isles. Next, Chris. So again, all these are people who have collected extensively and have distributed their plants both in the local collection, because by which the herbarium was established and they had a place to deposit the collection. Pendler, he made significant collections, which I saw at the Natural History Museum, and also recorded those collections. Next. So we come on now, similarly Hadmore, but I come to Broadway. We all familiar. Broadway was one of the founding members of the club, as well as the Horticultural Society of Trinidad and Tobago. He was one of the most significant plant collectors for Trinidad and Tobago in the late 19th and the 20th century. He also had a successful business in those days. Natural history was a business, and he collected a lot of specimens and sent them, sold them abroad. I have seen Broadway in Sweden. I have seen it in Toronto. I've seen it at Britain. But he did not deposit his collection in the Trinidad Herbarium. Why? He was the assistant to Hart, and he and Hart never got along very well. So as a way of getting back at Hart, he refused to deposit in his collections in the Trin Herbarium. But Kew and those other places. He also worked well with Nathaniel Lord Britton, who was the first director of the New York Botanical Garden. And in the 20s and early 30s, Britton came down. He was the director of the intention of doing a whole flora of the Caribbean and South America. It was quite an ambitious project. And he came to Trinidad and worked with significant collection, 2 trips, I think, in 1920 and 1922. And they actually prepared a manuscript, which was never published, but there is a copy of that manuscript in the Herbarium Library. Right? So a preliminary documentation of the flora. And then you begin to get the superintendent of the Royal Botanic Gardens. Now, these people from the gardens started equally busy collecting. I don't think the collectors, the people in the garden today go out and do any active collecting, but I'm subject to correction. Next. So let's go into this period. So fast forward into the 21st century, the number of plant specimens collected from Trinidad and Tobago flora exceeds 70,000 specimens at the National Herbarium, and probably another 30,000 in herbaria in Europe and North America. So at least over the last 400 plus years, we probably have over 100,000 specimen records of the flora of Trinidad and Tobago in herbaria locally, nationally. So we have been well documented. So I come up to period 3, and this is the publication of the flora. Flora projects are often driven by enthusiasm of small groups of individuals. The flora of Trinidad and Tobago was no exception. Kruger, who you remember was the third superintendent of the Botanic Garden, he made an attempt and published an outline of the flora of Trinidad, not Tobago. By this time, Tobago was not in this spill of, when did we come annexed to Tobago? 18 whatever. Yeah, try and remember our local history, right? But he did present a description of the vegetation of Trinidad and list of families and genera. So when you're doing any kind of research on the flora of Trinidad and Tobago, you definitely have to go back and see what some of these people recorded. Next. Next, Chris. Oh, sorry. So then we had the establishment of the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture in 1921 at St. Augustine, and it became the forerunner of the Faculty of Food and Agriculture, which is now on the St. Augustine campus, right? Initially, the Botanic Gardens, the herbarium was moved from the Botanic Garden, and in 1947 to the Imperial College, and in 1973, the government of Trinidad and Tobago took over funding of the herbarium, and it became the National Herbarium of Trinidad and Tobago, with UWI as its custodian. And therefore, the flora of Trinidad, I just have a little summary of all of this, and I'll just see if I can see. But volume 1, look at this. Volume 1 started in 1928. Williams was then the curator of the Botanic Garden, and in 1928 to 1947, 8 parts of that volume. So it took 19 years. And many botanists, two of them. Cheeseman was one of the professors at Imperial College at that time. Next. Then volume 3, volume 2 first. Go back. So Flora volume 1, this is volume 2. Yeah, sorry. So volume 2, you'll see it has 11 parts to this volume, and this part took from 1928, so it overlapped with the first volume, and this took 54 years to produce, right? Guess why it would have taken so long? 28, 40, 53. What do you think is happening in this period? World War, right. So because of war, they couldn't transport material back and forth. It was treacherous traveling on the seas, etc. So this thing. But a lot of these people are now not only from the Imperial College, well, they have Baker and Cheeseman, they were from the, but some of these people were from overseas herbaria, right, taking up parts of the flora. Next. Then now we have volume 3, and volume 3 covers what is called the monocot families, right? And that went on from 1967 to 1992, by which time we no longer had the Imperial College, because we now transferred from Imperial College, the Faculty of Agriculture, in 1960. So now you see all these people are now overseas botanists, now writing up the flora. And in spite of that, this took approximately 25 years to do volume 3. And believe it or not, I was part of the sort of proofread this version, this Cyperaceae. And believe you me, it took government printers 6 years to publish this. So you can see the rate at which the kind of interest in producing this kind of, how protracted it can become, or it is. So we stop there, right? So next. So in spite of all of that publication and the total number of botanists that participated in volume 1, 2, and 3, were 22 authors. Huh? We still didn't cover the palm flora. We didn't do the fern flora. We didn't do the gymnosperms, which are your things like your podocarpus, and we didn't do the grasses, right? So you all are familiar with this grass in the river swamp, right? Yes? Yeah. So, so to fill that gap, of course, we published the flora, the palm flora of Trinidad and Tobago, which I have a copy of sitting there. Schultes did the orchid flora separately, apart from in the flora style. And this is nice because there's a lot of drawings inside there. And so quite useful to look at that for identification. Then, of course, we started popularizing the flora with the native trees by Victor and Frankie and Paul did the photography. And then Professor Duncan now tackling the guide to the flowering plants, the flowers, right? And then we had the first bit on the medicinal plants of Trinidad and Tobago by Dr. Seaforth, Adams, and Sylvester. Next. So the period 3, the impact of the herbarium in its collection. So over 30,000 specimens have been identified for students, visitors, and researchers over the last 50, 40 years. And this is a good example of, you probably will remember our club member, Roger Nichols. This is some of his photographs, which he brought for us to identify. At the time, he was doing a calendar for some company or the other and wanted the botanical names to add to it. So this is how we make our contribution to the flora effort. Right. So what happens about research? Because we had such a good collection, local reference collection in the herbarium, as well as the, it was also documenting the whole flora of Trinidad and Tobago and updating those 3 volumes of the flora that I showed you. We got a Darwin-funded project with Oxford University, and they guided us to do a national botanical inventory. And we implemented something called the RBS protocol, which is the Rapid Botanical Survey. And this was recommended by Dr. William Hawthorne. He was quite an expert in this. So we actually surveyed 211 plots in Trinidad. So you can see all of that. Every dot is a site collected from Tobago, 29 plots. So we did 240 plots. This took us 3 years of steady field work to do that. Next. So what was the result of all of that work? When we did this survey, the number of plots survey, as I showed you, is 240. The number of samples collected to identify 22 specimens in a matter of 2 years. The number of species that when we identified it, we identified a total of 1,530 species, not specimens, species, okay? So the number of endemics, 40 now, 12. I didn't add this up because there's overlapping between the plants in Tobago and Trinidad, okay? Similarly, the number of indigenous species collected, 1,241 and 447 Tobago. So the number of exotic species, 185 and 64. So when we bring all of that together, the checklist that I was putting together, the revised checklist I was putting together, plus the field the updated field material, we came up with a summary of the flora now that we know. We have approximately 2,407 species in Trinidad and 96 in, in Tobago. And some of the species overlap, okay? Similar, but there are 90 species found in Tobago, not found in Trinidad. Similarly, indigenous species, and you have exotics. We have approximately, so nearly 1/3 of our flora is made up of exotics. And why do you think that might be so? Introduced because of the Botanic Garden. And so they had a lot of introductions and the active part there. And Tobago, to a lesser extent, there are less exotics in Tobago, although it's smaller, but you can see what is happening in Trinidad. Endemism, 108 species, or a total of 122 when you add those two up, okay? So what does that mean in all of this research? Well, from when we do all this fancy statistical analysis using computer software and all that fancy digital stuff, we were able to come up with the botanical hotspot. And that's our botanical hotspot. You know what part of Trinidad that is? Cerro del Rico, Tucuch, that part of the northern range. We have a little bit here in the Matura area. Tobago, of course, is the main ridge. Of course, the yellow areas are also areas with rare, threatened, and endangered species. But look at this map. This map shows the rainfall pattern or moisture. And you can see there is a strong link with moisture and biodiversity. So as we have higher rainfalls, like in these areas, we have more species diversity. And particularly, we have the epiphytic flora, things like all those orchids and bromeliads and ferns, etc. So as we get drier, the diversity falls. Again, you see how the temperature here relates to the southern range and central range. Okay, next. And so as a result of that, I was able to publish a checklist. So this is the publication, and I have a copy of it here in Phytotaxa. It is the annotated checklist of the vascular plants of Trinidad and Tobago. And it is the result of that huge national inventory, documenting all those records that I showed you, I mentioned to you. And then in the process, we did a complete revision, and it now includes the grasses, Poaceae, 262 species of grasses. So here we have a complete documentation of the vascular flora of Trinidad and Tobago. Okay? So we kind of fill that gap from those 3 volumes that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so let's look at some of our diversity here. Of course, this is the botanical hotspot up here. And you can see how that is mist inside. You can see the moisture content. Here is one of our massive, lovely ferns, tree fern. This is up at the top of Cerro del Rico. And this is well over 10 meters high. And it's really more confined to that sort of habitat and environment. Similarly, we have this Aicmea arepensis, which again seems to have altitudinal gradient limitation. So some of you may have seen this, and it's a very attractive bromeliad. Next. So you're looking at now, this is Tobago, and what you're seeing here is what is forest disturbance, and all this is bamboo, right? As a result of fire, and this is bamboo taken. So this is a good example of what is happening with invasive species, and the bamboo is an invasive species. So this is the mountain forest, heights of Aripo. Some of you are familiar with it, and of course, Malawi Forest Reserve. Next. Again, so you have, you're looking at Caroni swamp. Look at that. So we have the mangrove swamp as one form of water type of vegetation, and you have, of course, the freshwater swamp, which is your swamp. Then we have one in south, this peninsula, and then we have on the northeast coast there, and which on the Windbelt Preserve, where you also see the turtles come up as well. Right. Next. Riparian forest. Look at the. This is the Urupush River, a famous club trip took us there. Madamas River, another one. What can you tell about this? This kind of riparian forest. How can we use this information? Why is this important? Exactly. So if we want to restore our watersheds, this is what the sort of thing we should be trying to recreate, because this is what is going to create the type of clean water and stabilizing the soil. Put in, I hear people want to put vetiver. Really? No, this is the sort of thing we want to recreate when we want to restore our degraded and destroyed waterways. If we want to really be serious about flooding from the top down to the bottom. So, and this is natural, and this is what we want to recreate in the future for conservation. Next. Of course, we have mud volcanoes. You're all familiar. You know, it's a very, very, what kind of soils we have here? It's a very toxic soil, and it is very, no, not acidic, it's very alkaline, high alkaline. So you'd see nothing grows, but yet still around the Tastic, you get good vegetation. But what is interesting, the vegetation around mud volcanoes is not unique. And you know that from the publication we did on the Aripo on the mud volcano vegetation. There's nothing unique about it. It's just that nothing will grow on these mud flats. Next. Then, of course, coastal, you can see you have the swamp here forming on the Gulf of Paria. You have the wind belt, which is a mixture of forest and wetland. Then you have Point Radix, which is a completely different soil type, and vegetation is different there. And similarly, your Maracas Bay, when you go to Maracas Bay, you enjoy seeing the northern range on the landscape. Then, of course, we have caves, and while there would be other kinds of flora inside there, but not thing. But we found a lot of palm seedlings inside these caves, and it is very much the fruit for the young oil birds. So it is very important food source for our birds, and it is why so important that we maintain our palm flora. Okay. Right, so look at some of our life forms. This is one of our most famous small shrub or tree, the double Shoconia. This is now, it has now been designated the National Flower of Trinidad and Tobago, I think in 2017. It's a small shrub or tree. It is found only in cultivation. It's a beautiful ornamental. It's a mutant which originated in Trinidad, but is probably now extinct from the wild. So there should be some kind of preservation order on all plants that are in existence right now, because we have no wild source for the double Shoconia, right? So that's something to think about. But this is the single variety, which we find all over. We could see it even as low as Mountain Benedict and all around. And just to be botanically correct, this is not a petal. This is actually this part of this, what they call the calyx, and it's the calyx that modified, or the sepal, and became petaloid. So it's really the sepal that mutated and give you this bright red petaloid sepal. It is not a petal. The actual petals are these, right? And you can see how this came out. So I thought this might be an interesting bit of botany. Next. And some of our epiphytes, of course, this is Virzea splendens. This was interesting because normally when you see Virzea splendens, if you all remember this nice red bromeliad, and you can see it in Mont Bleu, it's usually one spade, right? But this one had two branches, and I saw it going up the L to Cooch, and that's why I photographed it at that time. So if you ever see another one with two branches, it's not very common. Yeah? And of course, these are the selaginellas. These are the fern allies. These are filmy ferns. These ferns are just very transparent. They are one cell thick, and they literally drape on all those trees and trunks at the higher altitude. You have orchids. Most of our orchids that we are familiar with are introduced exotics, right? These are not native species. They are all introduced exotics. This is Acmea diclomedia, which is supposed to be endemic to Trinidad, and it was displayed at the Chelsea Flower Show that year when I visited it, and we came second in that contest. Yeah, and we think we came early on, right? So lianas, these are any wiry or woody free-hanging climbing plants. And you know, sometimes they say you can cut this and drink water from it. Yeah, I think that's one of the things they tell her. They contain a lot of water in it. Um, no, I believe this is Bohinia, which is sometimes this is one that kind of looks like a ribbon that in the forest. Yeah. All right. So other families that produce these nice big lianas, and you can see scale, right? That's supposed to be me, I think, from behind. Look at that size of this liana versus me walking there. Well, I don't have to be very big to be scaled, eh? So Bignoniaceae, Malpighiaceae, Leguminaceae, Dilleniaceae. These are the families where you have some of these lianas being formed. Next. Right, so we have stranglers. You're familiar with the fig, all the ficus species, and then you have the clusia species that strangle. So there is this ficus strangling the um, mother plant in the back. This was taken in Shakari on a field trip with the club in January, I think 2001, when we went to the club there. Next. And parasites, right? These are the love vine. Everybody's familiar with the love vine, and they often confuse this one that you find in the Arepa savanna. But they are two distinct species. Believe it or not, this is a member of the Convolvulaceae family, which is the family with all those lovely big bell flowers that I showed you. Cascuta, and Cassita is a member of the Lauraceae family, which is the avocado family. So it's kind of does stretch your mind to think that this is related to the avocado, and this is related to the Convolvulaceae group. Next, but go back, Chris. But I found an interesting bit of ethnobotany for this thing. The Cassiter filiformis in Arupusan. This is a source of brown dye in East Africa. I picked up that in Mabili in 1982, useful and ornamental plants. Yeah. And as you know, the Cuscuta love vine, a lot of people use it as folk medicine. Yeah. As a cooling. Yeah. I'm not recommending anything, okay? I'm just following what the literature says. Carnivores, of course, everybody's familiar with all these cute little plants on the Arepa savanna, the utricularias that look like little mini orchids, yeah? Well, they have bladders at the base of their root area, and this is a response to a nitrogen deficient environment. So they actually have traps, they're little tiny, like little tiny balls, and these traps open and they get insects trapped in them, and then they have digestive enzyme, and that's their source of protein. In the case of the Drosera, which again you're familiar with, they have on their leaves, they have this tactile glands on the leaf, and as soon as an insect touches it, the glands, it sticks, and then the enzymes destroy it, kills the insect, and they then digest it. So that's right. So remember I was telling you about the love vine? The love vine is in this family, believe it or not, yeah? So some of our vines, Mucuna, everybody familiar with Mucuna pruriens, Cowich, beautiful flowers, but the fruits are absolutely deadly if you ever get How many of you ever encountered, yeah, point good, cowitch? Yeah, cowitch, yeah. We had an interesting case of um, a lady who came into the herbarium to identify, well, she didn't, yeah, but the way she brought it in, she brought me a bag of clothes and told me that to identify if there's cowitch on this plant. Very interesting. I think I wrote it up in the editorial. But the story is that she was in court with her husband and he had put cowitch all over the house, right? But the interesting thing about it, and of course the lady went everywhere to try and get help, and somebody in forestry division tell her, go to the herbarium. And this lady walks with this bag of clothes and tell me to identify cowitch in it. And she was in tears. And I thought, oh my God, what I said, all right, could you find this cowitch, a plant for me in Tobago? Because the whole story is in Tobago. And she lives in Tobago, and I think her husband was from Tobago, and etc. But they lived in Tobago. And sure enough, she did bring a specimen of what they called cowitch. And it turned out to be, I identified it correctly based on herbarium collection. And it was the first record we had from Tobago of Mucuna appearance. We always had it in Trinidad. Yeah. So this is how, doing herbarium work was almost like a detective type of job in some sense. It was always very interesting cases. So we did a specimen of it. I kept a voucher specimen in the herbarium, and we sent a voucher for the forensic lab to look at it and see if they could match the hairs on the thing with the clothes. Whatever became of that, I don't know. But that we got a lovely specimen from Tobago, a first record. Yeah. Next one. This one. Go back, please, sorry. Yeah, this one is found on the cliffs of Toko. I saw this thing. It's a very tiny flower. It's supposed to be endemic. I think this is under threat right now with the type of development that is going on Tobago by the lighthouse. I don't know if you all have been there recently, but I think we should look at this. And it's a very, very small populations there, but they form a lovely bedded on the cliffs of Turkey, and that's one of my collections. Next. Again, so here we have ferns. You saw the magnificent tree fern we have there. This is an endemic tree fern to Trinidad and Tobago. You can get it as low down on the Mont Bleu. You can find this Cyathea sagittarifolia. It's quite a distinctive fern, very, very attractive. Of course, some of our aquatic ferns, you would see this in the Aripo savanna, in the swampy parts of it. This you often find this is actually an introduced fern, Keratopteris, and it is found a lot in rice fields. And apparently it is edible in Japan. Now, I'm not telling you all to eat it, okay? All right? It is Keratopteris talactroides, but I'm not telling you to eat it, but this is what the illiterators tell me. So similarly, you have this swampy area on the western front. There is Acrosticum danifolium. We have two species, Aureum and danifolium, in the swamp. You even see this along the betum, if you know what you're looking for. Yeah? So that's a very common. And I often wonder if these ferns may be useful in taking up heavy metals. That is something I've been trying to encourage our chemistry people to look at heavy metal tolerance of some of these aquatic species, like particularly this fern. Things. Hmm?
As in the mountainous fern there, as when you put on your hand and turn on.
No. That's not a tree fern. That's a little shrubby thing. That is Pictogramma calimelanus, and you stick it on your hand. That's no bigger than that. But this is like 10 feet tall. And so, right. So, yeah, but yeah. Well, all ferns tend to look, like that sort of thing. So, what is the impact of all these collections we've had over the years? We were able, together with a colleague from the pharmacy department, and late Dr. Seaforth, who was a natural product chemist, we did an ethnobotanical survey of the medicinal plants in Trinidad and Tobago, and we published that in 2015. And you can see all the sites. We visited 20 sites and interviewed people and what they use for, if they were using traditional medicine, and some of them were. And we put this in to show how we rationalize what is a rural community versus the built up urban areas. Yeah? And so these are samples that I kept from that survey in the herbarium. So you would have where we collected and what some of the common names they used in this, right? So that's another story by itself. Next one. So these are samples. Some of you may recognize this. This is Cucuma longa, which is not saffron, but turmeric. Saffron is a completely different plant. It doesn't grow here in Trinidad, but people apply that name saffron to this plant in Trinidad, okay? Here is, I'm sure some of you know this plant. What do you call this? Chandelier. Anybody had chandelier bush?
Yeah.
Well, actually, we had an exhibition at the green market and we put up these plants. This guy came up to me and he says, "Ma'am, you see that plant? I have that growing in my mother's garden. And I had a cough and I went and I take antibiotics. I went to all kind of doctor and I drink this and my cough went away." So that's an anecdotal story of chandelier. It is well used. Look, this lady is confirming that. So here we have, yes, you see, and there is good old. I think this is uh, uh, Zaba Peak. Everybody had Zaba Peak? It is bitter. Oh my God. But it is very effective, apparently. Yeah. Next. And then, of course, this is bachelor button. But this is introduced to, this is an ornamental that has also now come into medicinal use. And of course, we have lemongrass, another that is also now well adapted into our environment. Next. And how do we go from just being pure science, then we have this dictionary in which is a comprehensive record of the common names of plants and animals found in Trinidad and Tobago. I have a copy of that dictionary there. And some members of the club contributed to this publication. Myself, I helped with the botanical aspect. The late Hans Boos was very much involved with the animal name. I think Dr. Wilkin-Koo, anybody else you can think of, Jalal, contributed to this? But it is an excellent reference book for the common names of our plants and animals. Next. And I thought we can take our plant flora and go into visual arts. And here we have a collection that a Major Gretson bequeathed to the Imperial College of 147 watercolor paintings of wildflowers in Tobago at the time. And if you notice, you'll see labels here. These were actually used as teaching material for the Imperial College. That's why it's not only a bit of art, but also for teaching. And they would put it up on a frame outside because the whole Frank Stockdale in those days, they were laboratories. And every week they'll put up 2 and all that thing until some disgruntled technical staff decided to catch a frame of fire, and then they stopped showing it. And I rescued these 147 paintings, and now I have them nicely curated and in the Herbarium library. Okay, so that's it. Next slide. I just want to acknowledge Professor Stephen Harris of Oxford University, UK. He helped a lot with the historical reference and information. Dr. Mark Perrine, he allowed us and gave us permission to go into this Sloan collection, which is not open to the public. So you have to have permission to get in there and to photograph the book. And the staff of the Natural History Museum, for all the years I spent at Kew and BM recording the plants of Trinidad and Tobago. Okay, so that's it.